Hello, and welcome to this session of Leto Lectures as we continue our series, The Presidency 2020, as we get very close to the wire, Election Day, November 3rd. I'd like to begin with an explanation of how we've sort of changed our timing and producing these lectures as we get closer to Election Day. Today is October the 2nd. I'm filming this lecture later than I would have in previous months, recognizing, of course, that some very important scheduled events were going to take place very late in the month of September, like the debate this past Tuesday on September the 30th, and there were some important developments that were still unresolved regarding a second, third, fourth coronavirus package, as well as the unemployment number for the month of September, which would give us some guidance as to whether or not the job picture was on one of sustained improvement or perhaps sputtering. When we next meet for our November lecture, we're going to be meeting on the other side, metaphorically, after Election Day. And a little later in this lecture, we'll talk about some of the possibilities that make it likely that late on the evening of November the 3rd, we are not going to be able to go to sleep, as we have in previous election years, knowing with any certainty who'd won the presidential election. So we apologize for our spacing, but we're trying to bring, of course, as much information to you in as timely a fashion as possible. Now, as you know, late last night, early this morning, the news broke that President Trump and the First Lady Melania Trump had tested positive for COVID-19, as had a close presidential advisor, Hope Hicks. As we stand here today, the president has announced that part of his schedule going forward has been canceled. He's announced that he's beginning a period of quarantining, whether or not it's the traditional 14 days of quarantining or something more abbreviated remains to be seen. We know, of course, that in this debate Tuesday night in Cleveland, as is their habit, members of the president's entourage, including members of his family, the First Lady, and advisors, against the advice of the officials of the Cleveland Clinic, were not wearing masks in that closed environment during the 90-minute debate. What at this point we have not yet received information regarding is whether or not Vice President Biden, Mrs. Biden, or any members of the Biden family or team has tested positive for the virus. Something, of course, that by the time you see this will have already been known. Immediately, just thinking forward, if the president does in fact abide by the 14-day quarantining policy, it would make the next debate scheduled for October the 15th, 13 days from today, to be held at the Adrian Arsht Auditorium in Miami, very much in doubt. Or perhaps, if the president is feeling better, if he's COVID-free, the debate may go forward as scheduled. So last night and this morning, we've seen, of course, a significant curveball thrown into what's already been a very unusual race, given the constraints that COVID-19 has placed on the way in which candidates do or don't campaign. That's the introduction to where we stand today. Now, going back further, when the year began, we recognized that this was going to be a presidential race where an incumbent president was seeking re-election. We remark that in normal traditional times, it is very difficult to defeat an incumbent American president. Many of the trappings of the office, the attention-grabbing events that a president could engage in, the use of Air Force One, the use of the White House and the Rose Garden to stage events, has given incumbent presidents lots of advantages over rivals that might be challenging him. We've recognized, not just in this presidential election cycle, but many more preceding it, that unless our country is in an active state of war, voters tend to look to domestic issues and, more specifically, economic issues, pocketbook issues that very much influence the candidate for whom they are going to cast their vote for president. So when we met all those months ago, it seems really like years ago, in January to begin this series, we were looking at an American economy that was humming. The lowest unemployment rate in at least the last 50 years. Significant economic growth. We were watching an environment where the lowest quarter of wage earners in the United States were experiencing more than 4% wage growth per year, something not seen in a very long time. In an environment of that sort, had it continued, we would probably be seeing President Trump doing very well in polls and perhaps favored to sweep to winning another term as president. But of course we know that very late in January, then building through February, and then finally by the middle of March, this novel coronavirus, this COVID-19, was going to impose a historic disruption, not just in the American economy, with a shutting down of the economy for more than a month, still shut down to some degree today in many states. We were going to see American lives disrupted, and we were going to see a different way in which candidates, not just for the presidency, but for all elective offices, were going to have to campaign. So very clearly, COVID-19, a health challenge, the likes of which Americans as a people have not encountered in 100 years, since the great Spanish flu outbreak in 1918, 1919, and 1920, was going to pose challenges that were not just health-related, but ultimately were going to spill into the economics, the employability, and the income-earning ability of many Americans. And of course, given the fact that this, as we know, is a highly communicable disease. You just don't have to touch something and then touch your mouth to get it. Apparently, it is an airborne disease. Breathing it in, perhaps confined in Air Force One by people not wearing masks, could convey the disease. We were going to see campaigns run in a way that we have not had in a very long time. Now, one of the most highly anticipated events that has taken place thus far in this campaign occurred this past Tuesday in Cleveland, the first presidential debate. Now, we know that in recent presidential elections, the debate has become a routine milestone in late September, October, leading up to the Tuesday following the first Monday in November, which is Election Day. We know, of course, that both Lincoln and Douglas, who are often looked at as exemplars of great debaters, in 1858, Lincoln and Douglas, seeking the Senate seat in Illinois, engaged in 6 memorable debates throughout the state that were really debates. We've seen, of course, in modern times, our quote-unquote debates really be something different. But the first debate, historically, is not only the most watched of the number that take place, it is the one that voters overwhelmingly suggest that if they were undecided, the first debate among all the debates helped move them in one direction or the other. Many of you might recall the famous 1960 debate between John F. Kennedy and Vice President Richard Nixon. If you haven't, through the magic of the internet, go on YouTube, type in Kennedy-Nixon debate, and right before you in black and white, you could watch the entirety of it. And recognize that even in the last 60 years, that debate was a much more substantive one, a much more issue-driven one, a much more serious one, and one where both candidates demonstrated mutual respect towards the other, with the lack, of course, of any type of personal ad hominem attack. Most believe that John F. Kennedy, who won one of the closest presidential elections in American history in 1960, probably did so because he was perceived as having defeated Vice President Nixon by those who watched it on TV, while pollsters conducting polls of those who heard the debate only on the radio judged Nixon to have performed better than did JFK, an instructive moment in American broadcast history. If we fast forward 20 years to the presidential election of 1980, the incumbent president then, Jimmy Carter, was facing a challenge from former California Governor Ronald Reagan, who was really bringing a more conservative version of the Republican brand to the American electorate since Barry Goldwater in 1964 had similarly attempted to be a more doctrinaire conservative Republican. So it's not surprising that during the campaign season, the Carter campaign ran all kinds of ominous commercials. You know, Ronald Reagan is nothing more than Barry Goldwater with a smile and darker hair. He's dangerous. What'll he do? He's not ready for the job. And in fact, going into the debate that took place between President Carter and Ronald Reagan, the race was very close until Ronald Reagan, appearing before tens of millions of Americans, completely disarmed President Carter's arguments after one particularly severe accusation Carter had directed towards Ronald Reagan. Reagan remarked, "There you go again." And all of a sudden, following that debate, the concerns of tens of millions of Americans had subsided, and Ronald Reagan went on to a landmark landslide victory in winning the presidency. In the debates that have followed, we remember in 1992, 3 candidates on the stage: the incumbent George H.W. Bush, the Democrat Bill Clinton, and of course the third-party candidate Ross Perot, who ended up winning about 20% of the national popular vote. Sometime during the course of that debate, the elder President Bush was seen looking at his watch, and somehow that was one of the big takeaways from the media. When is this going to end? In 2000, George W. Bush and Al Gore engaged in a memorable debate where Al Gore in a split screen was seen sighing and smirking in reaction to statements that Texas Governor Bush had made. The Obama debates, pretty bland. John McCain and then Mitt Romney in 2012. And then, of course, 4 years ago, in the most watched presidential debate in American history, 84 million Americans watched, of course, this insurgent Republican nominee, Donald Trump, face off against Bill Clinton's wife, the Democratic nominee, Hillary Clinton. And those three, the first of three debates that were very memorable for the give and the take and the moving and the more personal ad hominem nature of the attacks that were exchanged between the candidates. So a lot was at stake all of a sudden this past Tuesday in light of the effects of COVID, the collapse of the economy, the nature of the rebuilding of the economy, and general concerns about the safety and welfare of Americans going forward. Ordinarily, a president seeking re-election hopes to be able to run on his record, hold it out there. Metaphorically, maybe ask the American people, you're better off now than you were when I took office. Elect me for another term, and you'll be even better when my second term is over. While the challenger somehow has to convince the electorate that the one term of the president in office has been lacking, has been a failure, and the need for change is very much abundant. So we saw Vice President Biden, and again, all during the debate, I took copious notes trying to capture quotes and statements. Biden, of course, tried to describe Donald Trump as a failed president, describe him as someone who blew the COVID-19 response, a man who only paid $750 in taxes in 2016 and 2017, someone who can't discuss policy with any specificity, and someone who has seemed to show support to white supremacist organizations throughout the country. President Trump, on the other hand, developed a strategy trying to show the deficiencies of Joe Biden. Now, we knew that this time around, there was not the ingrained animosity that seemed to exist within many American voters 4 years ago, be it against Bill Clinton or Hillary Clinton or both of the Clintons, that enabled President Trump, among other things, to very much demonize her, and in rallies to have crowds chanting, "Lock her up, lock her up." We've seen, of course, nobody yelling to lock up Joe Biden. We don't seem to see that well of animosity against Joe Biden as a person existing within the electorate. So the president instead looked at Joe Biden's age. He's 77. He will turn 78, in fact, a week or so following Election Day, and began to try to make the case that Joe Biden wasn't up to it mentally, that perhaps he was showing the signs of old age, perhaps he was suffering from a little bit of dementia, he was sleepy, he was weak, he was taking performance-enhancing drugs, and of course, in that condition, Joe Biden, who had positioned himself during the primaries as a more moderately positioned, inclined Democrat, who arguably won the nomination as a moderate, was going to be so inept, so confused, that he was going to be captured by elements of the more liberal parts of the Democratic Party, Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, AOC, and be drugged as the president to embrace these left of center policies. He was going to become a more socialistic president than he appeared to be on the campaign trail. And those seem to be the messages that the candidates were trying to communicate to the electorate during a debate, again, that was very raucous, no decorum, numerous interruptions, lots of personal attacks. You know, you're a clown, shut up, man, your son's a drug addict, your son's a thief, you're sleepy. If you were, and I think there are still some out there, a persuadable, undecided voter, and you had a checklist of issues that you wanted to hear the candidates address, you probably didn't leave that debate very happy, because that seems to be the nature of recent presidential debates. And in reality, in an environment where through social media, through cable television and cable news channels, through YouTube and Facebook and Twitter, candidates can get their message out through a variety of media. Debates seem to be more ritualistic, simultaneous news conferences where candidates perhaps try to talk to their base of supporters rather than to try to address concerns of those who might be truly undecided. So in the hope of sort of answering the question that is the title of this lecture, where do the candidates stand, I'm going to present briefly to you the position of each of the candidates regarding the important issues of the day. And then we're going to turn to our electoral college map and a list of states and battleground states to try to give a sense of where the race stands today, a snapshot of how the aggregate of polls show each candidate doing nationally. But that doesn't really matter because we don't use the national vote to elect our president. But more importantly, state by state by state, as we get into these very important battleground states. Now, the most important issue, clearly, in the minds of voters has been the coronavirus. The president has pointed out that he took proactive actions, to stop the virus from reaching the United States sooner than it did. The president frequently remarks that, yes, maybe more than 200,000 Americans have died from the coronavirus. 6 or 7 million have contracted it. Had he not taken the early actions that he did, he frequently suggests that maybe 2 million Americans would have been killed. He has described the administration's response to the coronavirus as a great success. He has teased the fact that a vaccine is coming very soon. Maybe a belated October surprise will be some announcement of some vaccine that is ready to be circulated. and has defended the fact that the administration has left the development of strategies regarding treatment, regarding the closing down of business, and regarding the reopening of schools to individual states, not developing a national strategy that might have been imposed uniformly among all 50 states. The wearing of masks became very much a divisive issue as the president, of course, generally avoids wearing masks, even among crowds of people that are not socially distanced. Tuesday night, he derided Vice President Biden of wearing this big, bulky mask all the time. And all of a sudden, in many communities, within many families, mask wearing and distancing became a divisive issue. But the president has given himself an A+ regarding his response to the virus. And just yesterday, prior to the announcement that Hope Hicks and the president and the first lady had contracted the coronavirus, he told a gathering at a fundraiser in New Jersey that the coronavirus challenge, COVID-19, is almost done and over in the United States. Now, the Biden campaign and Vice President Biden has critiqued the president specifically for not having developed and imposed one national policy regarding closures, regarding masks, regarding a variety of remedies at the outset of this. And of course, he remarked that in interviews with Bob Woodward in February, the president told Woodward he knew that this disease was highly communicable, he knew that it was dangerous, but he had played it down because he did not want to create a panic. 200,000 dead in the United States, a country that has 4% of the world's entire population, has produced about 20% of all the deaths worldwide from COVID-19, something that Vice President Biden mentioned several times. He's criticized the president for not following the science and scientists, and perhaps casting aside experts who have opinions that might differ from the president, sort of going doctor shopping to find one who will support endeavors of the administration. And of course, the vice president has criticized the president for not emphasizing the wearing of masks. And all through this campaign, the vice president has said, you can't solve the economic problems until you solve the coronavirus problems. Now, the next issue, economy, trade. President Trump could make the case, of course, that as of January and February, the United States was enjoying record numbers, very low unemployment, the stock market booming, wages growing. The coronavirus intervened. The president now asserts that the economic rebound from the coronavirus has been a very robust one. The stock markets are back up to pre-COVID levels. Employment is picking up. Today's unemployment numbers were announced that there were 661 new jobs added to the economy in September, and that the unemployment rate has dropped from 8.4% to 7.9%. The unemployment numbers are released on the first Friday of every month. Very Catholic of the Labor Department to do so. I think you would eat meat, though, anyway, on that first Friday. But This will be, thus, the last jobs report we have, barring something unusual coming from the Labor Department prior to the election. 7.9%. In modern times, that is the highest unemployment rate during a presidential election. 661,000 jobs added. That's a lot of jobs. But we now have a point where the COVID shutdown caused, we think, 22.2 million Americans to lose their jobs, and only about half of them have returned to employment. The other half still unemployed. And the unemployment number does not count people who have become so hopeless in finding a job that they have dropped out of the workforce, not considered employable, thus not considered part of the unemployment numbers. The president has suggested that we are in the midst of a V-shaped recovery, meaning that on a graph from a very high point, the economy crashed down to low levels, but just as quickly, like a letter V, is now returning to that previously high, earlier point. The president has suggested that these have been record job gains, record stock market gains. He suggested that through the use of tariffs, through the renegotiation of NAFTA, he has brought China to heel. He has equalized the economic playing field in North America between ourselves and Canada and Mexico, and has hailed them as both successes in his term in office. Now, Vice President Biden, of course, is labeling these times, these post-COVID times, as the Trump recessions. He says the tariffs haven't worked, and farmers and manufacturing jobs have actually suffered. He's described the recovery as a K-shaped recovery, meaning those in the upper middle class and the upper class have seen their fortunes economically rebound to pre-COVID levels, the top of a letter K, but that those in lower middle class and lower economic circumstances have seen their fortunes continue to decline. Job loss, inability to pay mortgages, inability to pay rent, inability to pay utilities, a lot of hunger issues existing throughout the United States. Biden repeats what every Democrat seems to say these days: the stock market is not an accurate picture of the economy. And Biden has talked about creating more jobs regarding renewable energy sources, the rebuilding of an infrastructure to bring back well-paying jobs in the United States. And of course, Biden advocates for the raising of the minimum wage throughout the country to $15 an hour, what Democrats call a living minimum wage. So again, different pictures regarding the economy, different pictures and versions of the effectiveness of the president's tariffs. Taxes, entitlement programs. President Trump is able to tout the tax cuts of 2018 as having been some of the largest in American history, putting more income into the pockets of workers and investors than they were able to earn before. Vice President Biden, of course, criticizing these tax cuts as really enriching those at the top of the wage earning scales. The corporate tax rate was lowered dramatically, but not really inuring to the benefit of working class Americans. Biden, of course, has promised, if elected president, to raise taxes on those making and earning more than $400,000 a year, while not touching the taxes and even reducing the taxes of those making less. The president, again, has spoken to the cutting of Medicaid, tried to do so earlier this year. Biden has criticized these actions as cutting away the social safety net in the United States, something that Vice President Biden has promised to strengthen through aid regarding housing, education aid, and the like. A more left of center argument to deal with these issues. Healthcare, probably somehow associated with COVID, an issue very much on the minds of Americans. It was, of course, the most important issue in the minds of voters who were polled after the midterm elections just 2 years ago. The president came into office, campaigned on the fact that Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, was a disaster. He promised to repeal it. Came one John McCain thumbs down away from actually doing so in the Senate in 2018, but has been affected in gutting large parts of the Affordable Care Act, including the mandate that everyone has to purchase insurance. And right now, the administration is supporting a number of individual states who are scheduled in November to argue before the United States Supreme Court that Obamacare should be entirely repealed, found now to be unconstitutional because of the lack of the individual mandate and other parts of the bill. The president has signed a number of executive orders regarding drugs, regarding pre-existing conditions. Executive orders, of course, are not legislation. In many cases are more symbolic than anything else. The president on the debate stage announced that because of his actions, the cost of insulin is now as cheap as buying water, as evidence that he is actually working to do these things. 4 years ago, he promised to replace Obamacare with, quote, something terrific. But today, 32 days before the election, has not released anything resembling a comprehensive plan to replace the Affordable Care Act, nor any legislative guarantee that the maybe 100 million Americans with pre-existing conditions or facing the imposition of lifetime caps on their health care coverage will be protected as they are under the Affordable Care Act. Joe Biden, of course, has had to walk a very fine line regarding health care as Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren advocated Medicare for all, universal health care. Biden wouldn't go that far and talked instead about propping up and protecting the Affordable Care Act, permitting people like myself and many of us here who have private health insurance to keep it, but expanding Medicaid and expanding subsidies so that those who can't afford health insurance can go out and acquire it with government help. Also, Biden talking about the need to lower the exorbitant costs of prescription drugs. Now, since late May, with the killing of George Floyd in Minneapolis, criminal justice and policing has become a very prominent issue in the eyes of Americans. The president has taken a very firm law and order stance. He's talked about the need to support the police. He's denied that there is anything close to systemic racism within policing organizations. He has very frequently encouraged state governors to ask for the use of National Guard troops. And he has looked at the peaceful protests and the rioting and the looting and the destruction, which has often taken place at the same time, as being the acts of far left groups, anti-government groups, and has blamed, of course, Democrats and very liberal Democrats for encouraging and supporting these types of action. The name Antifa has become a household word. Antifa, of course, an acronym for anti-fascist, an ideology, really. You can't go to a city and join an Antifa chapter because they don't exist, but you can take to the streets and advocate the tenets of this ideology to, again, reduce the fascist, as they call it, police state actions of many law enforcement agencies around the country. Firm law and order. While at the same time, the president has been reluctant. He finally did last night on an interview on Sean Hannity's program to categorically, equally repudiate white supremacist groups who, from a different place on the political spectrum, have been very active, have been very organized. The Proud Boys, for instance, the group that came up in the debate the other night, does have chapters, does have members, does have a man who lives in Westchester County, New York, who is the leader and the founder of this group. The president has been accused of being slow to repudiate it. He's now come along and did so pretty categorically last night. Now, regarding policing, Vice President Biden, of course, has stated that Black lives do matter, one of the great slogans regarding these police on minority situations. He says police are honest and hardworking, but there's a need to weed out the bad apples and a need perhaps to retrain the police to be more sensitive in dealing with those whom they encounter throughout their days. Peaceful protests, Biden says, are okay, but rioting and looting never is. So a more nuanced view, perhaps, and a more forgiving view of those who take to the streets from the vice president, and more of a declaration that some police departments have to watch who their members are. Now, voting, government, the courts. President Trump on Tuesday night, I think, very forcefully made the case to his supporters that in his time in office, he has placed nearly 300 federal judges in the federal district courts, the circuit courts of appeal, and now with Amy Coney Barrett, he has now nominated what will probably be his third justice to the United States Supreme Court. 3 out of 9, 1/3 of our nation's highest court. On the other hand, the president has for several months been very critical of what really, I guess, is going to be more of a necessity in many states, and that is an inclination by many Americans to vote by mail. Many states, like my home state of Florida, have permitted mail-in voting for a very long time. Other states do. Some do not. And some states require that in order to obtain something slightly different, an absentee ballot, a voter has to factually demonstrate why they are going to be away from their voting precinct in order to vote by absentee ballot. The president has called these mail-in ballots the basis of stealing an election, of fraud, of creating a fraudulent election. Even though these votes are going to be cast, that of course is the primary reason why come the evening of November the 3rd, we're probably not going to know with any security who our next president is going to be. Biden has pointed out the trend in mail-in voting. He recognizes, and of course we recognize, that many states have opened up mail-in voting as an alternative to in-person voting as a response to the coronavirus. Many states don't have as organized a system, for instance, as we do in Florida. And regarding courts, Vice President Biden has very clearly not committed to, if he were elected and Democrats were to control both houses of Congress, he would not state that he would not support the packing or the increasing of the number of justices on the Supreme Court. As we know, and as we've talked about in the past, Article 3 of the Constitution, which creates the federal judiciary, states that all judicial power shall reside in a Supreme Court and any other lower courts that Congress may choose to create. Right here in Article 3 of the Constitution. The Constitution does not say how many justices there shall be on the Supreme Court. It does not create any court beside the Supreme Court. So through our history, we've seen, of course, Congress create lower federal courts. We've seen the number of justices on the Supreme Court bounce around from 6, who would pick 6, by the way, to 7, to 9, to 10 during the Civil War. And then since about 1869, 9 has been the number. But there is nothing constitutionally that would prevent any Congress from sending to any president a judiciary act calling for an increase in the number of justices in the Supreme Court. These seats to be filled, of course, by the president in office who signs the bill. President Roosevelt attempted to do this in 1937 with very large Democratic majorities, by the way, in the House and the Senate. The Senate would not vote to permit him to do this. And now, of course, Biden and the Democrats are being accused by the president if coming into office, they will disrupt what might be a 6-3 conservative to liberal ideological balance on the court by adding justices to the court. And I think very notably, Vice President Biden has refused to deny he would do this. He suggests that all attention should be focused on the president's nominee to fill Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's seat. She passed away, of course, since we held our last lecture. And the argument has been that people are already voting now, just like the Republicans 4 years ago did not hold hearings on the man President Obama nominated to replace Antonin Scalia, who died in February of a presidential election year, 2016. Mitch McConnell should not permit there to be a hearing on Amy Coney Barrett, who the president nominated within just 2 months of the election following the death of Justice Ginsburg. That is where Joe Biden has tried to put the attention. Now, foreign policy is a big part of what our president does, and we've seen, of course, the president be able to tout significant successes in Middle Eastern policy, causing two countries, the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain, to join Egypt and Jordan as Arab Middle Eastern countries who recognize the right of Israel to exist, who established diplomatic relations with Israel, and has caused lots of other Gulf Arab states like Kuwait, like Saudi Arabia, like Oman, to not formally recognize Israel, but to work much more closely with Israel as they ever had regarding what is now perceived to be their common enemy, the country across the Persian Gulf from the Middle East, Iran. And the president, of course, has pulled the United States out of the Iran nuclear treaty and has really increased economic pressure on Iran and took out the leader, of course, Qasem Soleimani, around New Year's Day, the leader of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard. I think a very significant step, no matter how you view it, left or right, in the Middle East, lost, of course, in this domestic COVID job, criminal justice-oriented election. The president has tried to take significant actions against China. The China challenge, of course, our greatest foreign policy challenge as a country, the imposition of tariffs, the attempt to restrict the theft of intellectual property by Chinese companies, trying to prevent the Chinese state from backing large firms unfairly competing with those in the United States. The verdict on all of those actions, of course, mixed, still a work in progress. The coronavirus, of course, emanating from Wuhan in China, has caused the president to become very critical of China, refers to the virus frequently as the China virus, and has sort of made stillborn any of these developments that may result in better policy, and has created, I think, a more acrimonious relationship between the United States and China. Our relationships with Russia, again, wanting to exert more control in their part of the world. Vladimir Putin, very much a revanchist, trying to put together a greater Russia, a larger Russian sphere of influence. Very little public interaction between our government and Russia, very little public interaction between the president and Vladimir Putin. The president, of course, made this great overture towards North Korea, and the man he previously called Little Rocket Man, Kim Jong-un. Summits were held. The president traveled to the 38th parallel to meet with Kim at the border between North and South Korea. No progress on North Korea eliminating its stockpile of nuclear warheads. No evidence of North Korea destroying missiles that it's built that have longer and longer and longer ranges. They even tested an intercontinental ballistic missile. Recently, a lot of evidence suggesting that North Korea has continued to build, continued to stockpile, continued to do research on their nuclear arsenal, even though there's been this exchanging of letters and this close personal relationship between the president and Kim Jong-un. Again, the verdict still out. Has this been a beneficial reaching out by the president with the leader of North Korea? Joe Biden talks about having been a leader in the development of foreign policy in the Senate, calls himself the guy that President Obama used to go out and meet with leaders all around the world, somebody with experience, somebody who's more of a traditionalist, somebody who respects international institutions like NATO, like the United Nations, like the World Health Organization, telegraphing to Americans that he would return to positions that previous presidential administrations, both Republican and Democratic, have held. But notice, of course, the lack of any significant foreign policy discussion. And if you labor through these endless commercials, very little about the foreign policy picture that is an important part, typically, of a presidential campaign. Climate and the role of government in the climate. The president, of course, has questioned assertions that man contributes to climate change. The president has been a very strong supporter of the United States continuing to utilize our vast bounty of fossil fuels, not just oil and natural gas, which through the process of hydraulic fracturing or fracking has greatly increased American energy production. We are now the world's largest oil producer. The president has talked about keeping the coal industry alive and continuing to use coal to generate electricity. The president, again, reflexively challenging arguments of man-made climate damage, very much attacking regulations that have placed limits on energy extraction. He's talked about how the turbines of windmills might cause cancer. I think he was being sarcastic then when he said that. But again, someone very skeptical of climate change arguments. Joe Biden, of course, is on the other side of this issue. Careful to say he does not support the Bernie Sanders AOC Green New Deal. Biden instead has said that the United States can in fact become more carbon neutral by the 2030s and the 2040s. And in becoming a country that generates our energy through renewable sources, Biden suggests that millions of good-paying jobs could be created in this new green energy industry. He's talked about the rebuilding of infrastructure to be more climate friendly. And of course, he's noted hurricanes, wildfires, this crazy derecho, this storm that traveled through Iowa and devastated parts of Iowa, to be again evidence of the climate reacting and the environment reacting to human actions here on Earth. Immigration. The president promised, if he were elected, to build a wall. And in fact, the wall right now is very rapidly under construction. I read that maybe as many as 2 miles a day are now being constructed on this wall. He said Mexico would pay for it. Mexico, of course, is not. But the president is also carrying through on promises to stop the flow of undocumented people from Central America, Mexico, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala coming into the United States, and more aggressively identifying and deporting people who are in this country illegally, who are undocumented. The president has criticized sanctuary cities who give harbor and don't cooperate with federal agencies in identifying undocumented workers, individuals. And the president has greatly reduced the number of refugees who are, under American law, permitted to come to our country as a haven if they could show that remaining in their home countries, because of their gender, because of their religion, because of their race, because of their ethnicity, or because of their political beliefs, those 5 reasons, they would be in imminent danger. Prior to 2016, the United States admitted about 110,000 refugees who had earned that status to come and live in our country. This year, the number is down to 18,000 refugees. And earlier this week, the president announced that number was going to drop even lower to just 15,000. The president has gone to court trying to have DACA, deferred action against childhood arrivals, those brought to the country illegally by their parents when they were children, found unconstitutional. The Supreme Court, largely on a technical reason, didn't rule on the constitutionality of DACA. They may sometime in the future. And the president has generally spoken of reducing all types of immigration, even legal immigration, quantitatively in numbers in the United States going forward. Vice President Biden has promised to protect DACA, which was created, of course, in an executive order signed by President Obama, to find a way to legalize many of those in the country illegally, undocumented, and to try to increase the admissibility of immigrants into the United States, as they are a vital part of various sectors of the American workforce. Couldn't be more different. Abortion. In previous elections, of course, abortion, a hot button issue, the really first, quote, social issue that has made its way to the stage of presidential debates and presidential elections. President Trump, of course, has staunchly been pro-life, has staunchly garnered support from evangelical Christians, conservative Catholics, who again prioritize the restriction of abortion as a very important issue. And of course, Amy Coney Barrett, his nominee to the Supreme Court, is someone who has unabashedly been anti-choice, pro-life, however you want to describe it, has written about the seminal case of Roe v. Wade, decided in 1973 as having been an abomination, and has publicly advocated a belief in the so-called heartbeat laws, that a fetus, once a heartbeat is detected, is a person subject to protection of American law. To put the decision in Roe v. Wade in a different, maybe less artful way, Roe v. Wade said that an unborn fetus does not have a constitutional right to be born. These positions, these so-called heartbeat statutes, seek, of course, to undo the implicit ruling in Roe. Gun control, an issue, of course, that in previous elections maybe more was talked about. Haven't heard much about it this time around. The president, of course, protects our Second Amendment, tells his supporters he loves our Second Amendment. Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren are coming to take your guns. He's the only thing between them and the right of Americans to keep and bear arms. Joe Biden has spoken, again, not too much about gun control, but he has supported things like universal background checks. He's supported closing the gun show loophole to acquiring firearms. And he has supported so-called red flag laws that permit courts to be petitioned to take firearms from individuals who are undergoing various sorts of stress or psychological challenges. But that's about it regarding, again, this previously very contentious issue, gun control. The handout that you'll receive for this lecture will spell out the positions of these issues just like we have today, as of today. Now, the state of the race. Where do we stand on October the 2nd, 32 days before Election Day? To recap, of course, we know that we do not elect our president by the national popular vote. We know that as recently as 2000, and then again 4 years ago in 2016, the candidate who won the most votes nationally didn't win the presidency because their opponent won the electoral vote, the only vote that counts. We know that every state in the union receives a number of electoral votes equal to the sum of the number of seats that state has in the House of Representatives, which depends on that state's population, plus the 2 senators that every state has in the United States Senate. So we add 435 total seats in the House, distributed among 50 states. We add 100 senators. That gets us to 535. And then D.C., which since 1961 has had the right to vote for president, has 3 electoral votes, giving us the total of 538. The Constitution states that in order to be elected president, a candidate has to win a majority of the total of electoral votes, which means at least 270. We know that the Constitution gives each state the right to determine how their electors are chosen and how they are distributed. And we know that with the exception of just 2 states, Nebraska and Maine, the other 48 states and D.C. award their electoral votes winner take all. The candidate who wins the most votes in a state, not necessarily a majority, just more than any other candidate, wins all of that state's predetermined number of electoral votes. So in practicality, that means that winning an American presidential election requires candidates in their campaigns to perhaps be the most sober and the most objective and the most realistic by recognizing that in our country today, there are lots and lots of states that vote consistently and predictably for the nominee of the same party election after election after election. Certain states always vote Democratic or always vote Republican, notwithstanding who the nominee might be. And under the Electoral College system, it does not make any sense for a candidate who knows he's not going to win the vote in a state to spend a nickel of advertising or a minute of his time there because you get nothing for finishing second. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense for a candidate who knows that he's going to win a state because his party's nominee always does to spend a whole lot of time campaigning in those states and spending money in those states because they're going to get more votes than their opponent there's no need to do so. So we know that presidential elections eventually boil down to a handful of what we call battleground states, purple states, states that have the demographics, that are geographically located in a way that often have rapidly growing populations. These purple states are not easily identified as either blue or red, so their electoral votes are the ones that the candidates end up fighting over. Now, as we look at our chart of battleground states, we once again recognize 435 plus 100 plus 3, 538 total, at least 270 needed to win. Your handout will tell you that these are the states from Alaska through Idaho to Montana to Utah, West Virginia, and Wyoming that are going to vote for President Trump, because these states always support Republican nominees. Their electoral votes total 116 arguably out of this 270. The handout will also show that these blue states, states like California, Illinois, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, now Virginia, formerly a red state, reliably vote for Democrats. If you add all of that up, you put into the Biden column 212 electoral votes of the 270 needed to win the presidency. 4 years ago, the map looked a lot like this, but at the time, 3 of these now battleground states, Pennsylvania, Wyoming, and Michigan, were in the Biden column, because none of those, or in the Hillary Clinton column, because none of those states, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, or Michigan, had voted for a Republican in a presidential race since 1988. Donald Trump won those states by a combined 78,000 votes. He won he won Michigan by 0.2% of the vote. He won Pennsylvania by 0.7% of the vote. He won Wisconsin by 0.8% of the vote. But he won, so he won all 46 of those 3 states' combined electoral votes, and thus won the presidency. So those 3 states are now here among the battleground states. They are, and again, some are new, some I've put speculatively into battleground territory, because again, I've used the aggregated polling data from realclearpolitics.com. I've looked at 538.com, and if you're really into this stuff, Google Economist Magazine election coverage, and you'll get more data. It'll make your head explode, like mine is about to, having looked at these numbers very closely for a long time. So Arizona, a state again, very, very firmly Republican voting, except of course, like other states in the Sun Belt, like Texas, like Florida, like Georgia, Arizona is a place where lots and lots of people from the Midwest and the Northeast have moved down to live in, particularly in Gila County, in Maricopa County, Phoenix, Tucson, and as a result, people take their voting, and you all know this, if you live in Florida or Texas and have moved from somewhere else, people take their voting habits with them. And if enough people come from states that are politically different than the state they're moving into, we'll begin to see the political dynamics change. So Arizona is very clearly one of these states. It has 11 electoral votes, and based on the average of polls today, Biden leads in Arizona by 2.8%. The handout you're looking at will hopefully have a more up-to-date average of the electorate, but this is how it stands now. Florida, the mother of all swing states, of all purple states, has the biggest prize up for grabs. Florida is the third largest state in the country. Whoever wins Florida wins 29 electoral votes. 29 is more than 10% of the 270 needed to win the presidency. Bill Clinton won Florida in 1996. George W. Bush won Florida in 2000 by 540 votes. He won all of Florida's then 25 electoral votes. He won Florida again in 2004. The Democrat Barack Obama won Florida in 2008 and in 2012, and by about 1% of the vote, Donald Trump won Florida in 2016. Right now, Biden has a 1.1 percentage point lead in the Sunshine State. Georgia is a new arrival to the swing state list, a large non-white population, a large African American population, a growing Hispanic population, lots of transplants coming to live in the Peach State. Georgia, 16 electoral votes, one of the larger states in the country now. Georgia, in polls up to today, has President Trump leading by 1.2% of the vote. Iowa, again, a traditional swing state. President Trump won it rather easily in 2016, but as of polling today, Iowa is tied, a dead heat, the only state of these swing states that are actually tied between the president and Joe Biden. Michigan, Donald Trump won it again by 0.2% of the vote. As of today, Biden is leading in Michigan by 5.2%. Is Michigan reverting to blue? Minnesota, an almost close but no call win for President Trump 4 years ago. A state that Republicans have long believed has the demographics to be turned red. Minneapolis, is in Minnesota. As we stand here today, Vice President Biden has a 9.4% lead in Minnesota. New Hampshire, again, another prototypical battleground state, the only one in the Northeast that really is. The Vice President Biden, 8.6% lead over President Trump there. Keep in mind that if we were doing this lecture 4 years ago, we might be reciting numbers that were sort of similar. Hillary Clinton leading in a lot of them. The pollsters tell us 4 years later they've got their models fixed, and these numbers are more accurate. But remember, we're just talking a snapshot of the average of these votes. North Carolina, another recent arrival to the ranks of swing state. 15 electoral votes, another large state, shows Vice President Biden leading by 0.5%. Ohio, 16 electoral votes. Again, like Florida, one of these historic battleground states. Point of interest, no Republican has ever won the presidency without winning in the Buckeye State, Ohio. President Trump won Ohio easily 4 years ago industrial workers gravitating to his message of bringing jobs back to the United States. Joe Biden, long a friend of labor in his career in Congress, enjoys a 3.3% lead in Ohio today. Pennsylvania, again, President Trump won it by 0.7%. Pennsylvania, huge, 20 electoral votes. Biden leads in Pennsylvania by 5.7%. Recent polls showing his lead in Pennsylvania seeming to increase. Wisconsin, the Badger State. Again, Donald Trump won it by 0.8%. Wisconsin, this great state politically, distinct regions voting in different ways. Biden today enjoying a 5.5% lead. I put South Carolina on this list because in recent polls, South Carolina, the Palmetto State, normally a bastion of Republican voting, has seen its polling narrow. We know that South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham, seeking a fourth term, is in a neck-and-neck race with his Democratic opponent, Jamie Harrison. We know that South Carolina has a large number of active duty and retired military, maybe some of them believing reports of what the president might or might not have said about troops and about veterans and about those who die in action. South Carolina is a state where President Trump is leading, but leading today by only 5.2% of the vote. The closest by far South Carolina has ever been at this juncture in elections going back to Bill Clinton in 1992 and 96. Texas, of course, the second biggest electoral vote prize, 38 electoral votes. Texas reliably red until, of course, the metropolitan areas of Dallas, Houston, San Antonio, and Austin have exploded in size, as have their suburbs, as have their exurbs, by lots and lots of people moving to Texas. 1,000 Californians a day, it is said, move to Texas, all from the San Francisco area. That's a joke to my Texas friends. But it's representative, of course, of how Texas is changing demographically. Democrats salivating, trying to turn Texas blue. Maybe one day it'll happen. It's on the map now, however, because President Trump has only a 3.2% lead in Texas. And we know that 2 years ago, Senator Cruz was reelected by about 2.5% of the vote in beating his Democratic challenger, Beto O'Rourke. And finally, Wisconsin. Wisconsin, 10 electoral votes. Wisconsin, again, Trump won by 0.8% of the vote. Wisconsin, now Biden having a 5.5% lead. And then we've got these two funny-looking designations, Maine's 2nd Congressional District, Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District. Those two states, Maine and Nebraska, are the only two that don't award electoral votes winner take all. 2 votes, electoral votes, go to the candidates who win the statewide vote for the 2 senators that those states have. And the 3 remaining electoral votes in Nebraska, they have 5, are awarded to the candidate who wins the vote within each congressional district. 3 in Nebraska, 2 in Maine. So there are 2 competitive districts, 1 electoral vote each, Maine's 2nd Congressional District and Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District, in a very close race, it could make the difference in a close presidential campaign. Now, one last point before we break is that there are other races on the ballot, particularly for control of the United States Senate. Currently, Republicans control 53 seats in the Senate. Democrats hold 47. If Joe Biden were elected president, Democrats would need to win a net of 3 seats to get to 50, a 50-50 tie. Vice President Harris, if Biden is elected, would be the president of the Senate, who would cast a tie-breaking vote. So 50-50 gives control to the party of the president. If President Trump were to be reelected, Democrats would have to win a net of 4 seats in the Senate, which again is probably an unlikely scenario of having that split arise. So states to watch, and we'll talk about them when we meet in our next presentation, include Alabama. Doug Jones, a Democrat, won a special election in Alabama to fill the seat of Jeff Sessions, who at the time was the Attorney General of the United States, defeating Roy Moore, an accused pedophile. Doug Jones is now up for a full term, and he is trailing Alabama's Republican nominee, former Auburn football coach Tommy Tuberville, by 10 percentage points. So the seat most likely to change hands is going to change from a Democrat to a Republican. In Arizona, former astronaut, the husband of Congresswoman Gabby Giffords, brutally shot several years ago in Arizona, is leading Martha McSally in a special election to fill the seat made vacant by John McCain's passing. Kelly enjoying a 5.2% lead, a Democrat seeking to fill a Republican seat. Similarly, in Colorado, the incumbent senator, a Republican, Cory Gardner, first term, is facing John Hickenlooper, the former mayor of Denver, the former governor of Colorado, now the Democratic nominee for the Senate, Hickenlooper leading by 7.8% of the vote. Colorado looks pretty close to flipping. In Georgia, first-term incumbent David Perdue facing a young Democratic challenger by the name of John Ossoff, the Republican Perdue leading in the polls by 2.8% of the vote. Iowa, this very curious swing state. Iowa has a first-term senator, Joni Ernst, who recently has begun to fall behind the Democratic nominee, Teresa Greenfield, a Iowan businesswoman, by 2.6% of the vote. As Iowa's presidential vote has gotten closer, so has its Senate vote. Iowa is one to watch. In Maine, Susan Collins, seeking her 4th term as Maine senator, is facing the Speaker of the Maine State House of Representatives, Sarah Gideon, and currently Collins is trailing Sarah Gideon by 6.5 percentage points, a large lead than compared to the past. Collins very much in danger. Maine, an independent-minded state, those Mainers, they don't call them maniacs for nothing. Collins, of course, having her feet held to the fire regarding the Brett Kavanaugh vote, acquitting the president in impeachment, and again, currently trailing. In Michigan, a first-term Democrat, Gary Peters, facing an Army veteran, a Republican, John James. Peters' lead is only 3.8% in Michigan. I suspect if the president somehow finds a way to come back and win Michigan, he may carry John James over the finish line as well. Currently, the Democrat incumbent, Gary Peters, with a very tenuous 3.8% lead. Montana, first-term Senator Steve Daines, in a state, Montana, that is a very, very red state, is facing as his challenger Montana's current governor. For a while, he was a presidential candidate, Steve Bullock. This race, again, in a red state that President Trump is going to win by a lot. Daines' lead over Governor Bullock right now is currently at 1.6%. North Carolina, another first-term senator, a Republican, Tom Tillis, is facing a Democratic challenger by the name of Cal Cunningham, and as things stand today, Cunningham enjoys a 6-point lead. And again, the Real Clear Politics average of polls in North Carolina. And finally, South Carolina, a big surprise. Lindsey Graham, seeking his fourth term as president, once described as John McCain's wingman, now described as a frequent golfing partner and supporter of the president. Lindsey Graham is facing a very well-funded Democratic challenger named Jamie Harrison. And right now, Lindsey Graham's lead over Jamie Harrison in the average of polls is at 1.5%. The handout you receive later this month will have these numbers updated, but control of the Senate is very, very much up for grabs. In the House, 435 seats in toto, 218 needed to control the majority and thus elect the House Speaker. Real Clear Politics currently has in the House Democrats firmly in control of 214 seats. Remember, 218 needed to hold the majority. Republicans control 190 seats, 31 seats too close to call, toss-ups, 19 of them held by Democrats, 12 by Republicans. Interestingly, 4 of these toss-up seats are Republican seats in the state of Texas. Seats, again, located in the suburbs of Houston, and I think one in the suburbs and parts of Austin as well. 3 seats in California, 2 close to call, 1 Republican, 2 Democrat. 2 Democratic-held seats in Virginia that flipped just 2 years ago in 2018, held by Congresswomen Lauria and Spanberger, 2 close to call. In New York, 2 Democratic seats, 1 Republican seat, 2 close to call. And in Pennsylvania, 2 Republican seats and 1 Democratic seat included among these 31 toss-up seats. For reasons that are very important, Democrats are trying to win control of more state house delegations to form a majority. Florida has 29 House seats. Currently, Republicans hold 15, Democrats control 14. They want to get on top of this for reasons that we'll discuss when we next meet. So, to all of you, I send my best wishes, of course. I hope everyone has voted, will vote safely, please watch these numbers. There'll be a blank electoral college map and another electoral college selections sheet in the handout that you've received in conjunction with this lecture, or maybe before. But follow the race, watch what happens on November the 3rd, and we will see you sometime in the week following the election, where, barring some unforeseen landslide in one direction or the other, the identity of the next president of the United States will probably not be fully known. So, happy Thanksgiving. No, that's too early. Happy Halloween, if that matters. Happy Election Day, and we'll see you all in November. Thank you.